Hey, welcome back. Segment 2, Gold and Black Live. I'm joined now by John Norberg. He's an institution in West Lafayette, and as far as Purdue University goes. John, of course, you probably remember his work for years at the Lafayette Journal and Courier. Worked there from 1972 to 2014, and also worked at Purdue University, overlapping some of that time from 2000 right up until now, obviously, or honestly. And John's got a great book coming out. I got to see him speak a few weeks ago at Fowler Hall. He's writing a book on the history of Purdue University. There it is on the screen right now. Ever True. 150 years of giant leaps at Purdue University. John, welcome, my friend. I know you're filled with stories, and one place I want to start is you told me off camera that athletics actually preceded the university at Purdue. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's kind of a fun story. Purdue actually opened officially in the fall of 1974, September 1974. But by law, they had to have a few classes that spring. So they just offered a few weeks of courses. Students couldn't even stay on campus. They had to come from Lafayette or Chauncey or wherever they lived, and took some classes. And there was actually, in April of 1874, before the school actually opened, Purdue played a baseball game with Ford School in Lafayette. And athletics actually precedes the start of the university. And if you're going to do a history of Purdue University, you've got to talk about athletics too. It's an important part of our history and our culture and our soul.
Sure.
And that's what I wanted to do with this history book. I wanted to tell the stories of people. I'm not very good at talking about buildings and how much building costs and what year they were built, but I do love telling the stories of people. And we had some very, very interesting people, great people, characters in our history.
Now, before we get too deep into the stories, why don't you tell people when the book will be available and how they can get the book? And I'd also like to know, too, real quick, just the whole process of how you put it together.
Well, a couple things. May 6th is our Founders Day. That's the day the Indiana General Assembly, it actually was the House, finally passed the Senate bill. It's also the day that Governor Conrad Baker signed it, and that is our anniversary date, May 6th. And so the book will be out May 6th, which seemed like an appropriate day to have it. It can be bought directly through Purdue Press. Purdue Press is the publisher, and beyond that, it can be bought any place that sells book. A couple other history books coming out at the same time later on this year. Angie Klink has a history book coming out on fraternities and sororities, or maybe that's early next year. An agriculture book coming out in the fall is very good. And the people in our archives have done a wonderful book full of a lot of photos from our history. It's a fun story.
Sure.
Mitch has kind of focused the centennial activities around looking ahead, and that's what we should do. When we have anniversary dates, we should look ahead and think, what are we going to accomplish in the years ahead? But it's also a good time to look back and see what we did in the past and tell some fun stories. I like to tell, baseball was one of the first sports we played here, and our first graduate was John Bradford Harper, and we had a great faculty member who would go on to become father of the Pure Food and Drug Act, Harvey Wiley. Harvey Wiley was pitching, and Bradford, the student, was catching, and he was smoking a cigar at the same time. And Wiley threw the pitch, the student missed, and the cigar went halfway down his throat and almost killed him. So if anybody asked him what he learned at Purdue, it was probably don't smoke cigars,
Don't smoke
while
cigars,
playing
yeah.
baseball. Baseball started first, track was going on. Football started in 1887, basketball by 1900. So you can see sports are at the very beginning of the formation of the university.
And John, when I saw you speak, you talked about, I think it was 1906 to 1907, Purdue and Indiana had no athletic competitions between the two schools. Tell that story real quick, why that occurred.
Yeah, it's a real interesting story. First of all, it started with a near riot at a Purdue IU baseball game at Stewart Field on our campus. It was the second game of the season. We lost that one, won the first one. But at the end of the game, there was nearly a riot. The intensity of the Purdue-IU rivalry goes back to the very beginning. It was intense. And in fact, it was too intense at that point. And there was also a dispute over eligibility rules. Purdue did not agree with the way IU was reading the eligibility rules in this new Western Conference, which became the Big Ten. The schools decided, let's cool it for a while, we'll just stop. In the meantime, Purdue and IU got into a true blood battle over who was going to operate the medical school in Indianapolis. This makes a Purdue-IU basketball game look like a Sunday school picnic. This was a real all-out war. And while that was going on, they couldn't get together and negotiate a resumption of athletic games. So in 1906, 1907, Purdue and IU did not play each other. Go back and look at the records. You'll see that year blank.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize Purdue did have the medical school in Indiana for a while. And they do have a famous alum from the medical school, right? Who's that?
A.C. Arnett, the co-founder of the Arnett Clinic.
So there you go. I didn't realize that was an eyebrow-raising moment for me. And I've actually shared that fact with some people. They didn't realize that at one time, yes, indeed, Purdue University had the medical school and not Indiana. And John, I know you want to talk, too, about, I guess, the African-American experience at Purdue for the student-athletes. Talk a little bit about the history of that at this university.
It was very important in this history book to talk about the African-American experience and to talk about it as part of Purdue history. It is part of Purdue history, and it isn't a separate story. It's part of our history. There were some African-American students here, even in the late 19th century. In the early 20th century, we did have some African-American athletes. They were playing in the team. By about 1910, that's gone. It's gone. And I couldn't find another African-American athlete pictured in a Purdue yearbook, the debris, until 1951. One player. I'm not sure if he was allowed to play in the games. I know that sometimes in the late 40s, early 50s, they allowed players to practice, but not play in the games, African-American players. The first African-American scholarship player was Lamar Lundy, which is a great name in our history.
Yeah. An
African-American athlete who played both basketball and football. Could have gone pro either way, went on to a great career. And gradually then, from that point on, from 55, we start seeing more and more African-American athletes. And that's very important in bringing other African-American students to our university, which we've been working on doing for a number of years. But by the late 1960s, you have great athletes like Leroy Keys here, and another one, Eric McCaskill, who was a hurdler. And we had, as everyone knows, in the late 1960s, it was a time of turmoil.
Yeah.
There was a lot of student unrest. In 1968, the African-American students marched on Hovde Hall and left a list of demands, what they wanted. And they were probably right with their demands because Hovde said they were. He said, I think you're, Fred Hovde, the president, Fred Hovde said, I have to agree with you. We're not doing what we should do. But what impressed me is that among those students that demonstrated was Leroy Keys and Eric McCaskill. Those students were risking their athletic scholarships by doing that. The university could have come through and say, get out of here. We don't want you here anymore, and that's it. That would have been devastating to them. That didn't happen. As it turned out, actually, Purdue felt they had legitimate concerns. Also, that led to the creation of the Black Cultural Center, which Leroy and Eric were both very much involved with.
Yeah, Leroy Keys, I talked to John this summer for a story I wrote for the Purdue Alumni Magazine, and I didn't know anything about a lot of the tumult John talked about from the late 1960s in West Lafayette on the Purdue campus. Now, it wasn't Berkeley or Kent State or Austin, Texas, anything crazy, but they did take over the Union at one point. John talked about occupying Hovde Hall, and Leroy Keys, I talked to Leroy, obviously, for my story. It's the 50th anniversary of the 1968 season. And he shared some of those stories about marching on Hovde Hall, and that really spurred the creation of the Black Cultural Center. They wanted more African-American faculty. And also they were also upset about, I think, tuition hikes as well. So it's, I talked to John about this. You could write an entire book about that experience, but I think it's a very undertold story.
Yeah, Leroy Keys and Eric, but Leroy is here now and has been here for a long time. He is a very important part of the history of our university, not only in athletics, but in our culture and in our academics and everything else. So he's just a major player.
Key figure.
And also the most enthusiastic Boilermaker
that's
ever lived.
Still looks good, got a heck of a handshake. Looks like he could still play. John, you want to talk, too, about 1967, the dedication over on Northwestern Avenue.
That was one of the great moments
in Purdue Arena at the
Purdue
time.
history. Yeah, it was the basketball arena. It wasn't named Mackey Arena.
Correct.
There were a few more years named after Red Mackey, football coach, longtime athletic director. And it opened in December. We started our season in December in those days of 1967. And it was a full house that day. And why was it a full house? Because Purdue graduate Johnny Wooden, the great legendary Johnny Wooden, brought in his UCLA basketball team, which I think had won 34 straight games at that point and would go on to win a lot more. He also brought Lou Alcindor, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And Purdue brought out a player debuting his first varsity appearance,
Guy by the name of Rick Mount.
Rick Mount, yeah. Words jump out of my head sometimes.
The Rocket
But Rick
from
Mount,
Lebanon.
a great scorer. You know, before the three-point shot came in, and he was, you know, just an amazing player. Well, Mount had a great game, led Purdue. Unfortunately, we lost 73-71.
Close.
But it was a great game. But really, that day, in spite of Mount, the great play he did, and everything else that happened that day, the real winner of that game was the arena. People loved it, and they still love it today. And it's a big part of the culture of our university.
Over 50 years old now, Mackey Arena celebrated his birthday a few years ago. Back in 2011, John, I think it was November, they rededicated it. They really revamped it, widened the concourses, added a lot of other amenities. So they kept the basic structure and the basic feel of Mackey. And as anybody knows who's been to a game there, they can attest that atmosphere there is quite volatile and quite enthusiastic. And speaking of Mackey Arena, Gene Cady, 25-year tenure. Share some stories about Coach Cady.
Yeah, just one thing before I get to that is one of the most emotional moments was when they brought Rick Mount back a couple of years ago.
Yes.
At halftime, and the tremendous ovation that he received. He certainly is still remembered and loved here. Gene Cady is got to be one of the great basketball coaches in our history.
Yeah.
He still comes to games and gets big ovations when they put the cameras on him. But people kind of forget that he almost left.
Yeah.
He very seriously was interviewed at Arizona State. That was the one school he said that he wanted to coach at other than Purdue. And they were in kind of a down point at that. They weren't having their best seasons. And he actually went out to Arizona State. They offered him the job. He came back, and President Steve Beering said, "I'd like to see you in my office." And they apparently walked around Steve Beering's office, according to the way Steve tells me the story. And Steve told him, "You know, you can't leave. You're loved here. We want you here. You're so much more important than basketball. You're, again, part of our culture, part of the spirit and soul of the university. Please don't leave." And he didn't. And Gene Cady told me that one of the reasons he didn't is that Steve Beering did offer him a little more money. But
Money talks.
After that meeting, Gene came out and had a press conference, an emotional press conference, and announced he was staying. And I'm certainly glad he did. I think all Boilermakers are.
Won a lot of Big Ten championships, got to a couple Elite Eights. Of course, Purdue's in the Elite Eight for the first time since Gene Cady was a coach back in the 2000 tournament.
That game last night is going to be one of the great games in our athletic history.
A heart stopper, right?
Yeah, there wasn't enough drugs to keep my heart going during that whole thing.
Join the club. And lastly, John, before you came on the set when you arrived today, I did not realize that the father of Title IX is a Purdue University grad. Talk about that.
Yes, well, in the early days, Title IX was in the early 1970s. Before that time, women did not have competitive athletics, intervarsity athletics. They had intramural sports, and they had very limited amount of that. But in the early 70s, one of our graduates, Senator Birch Bayh, became the father of Title IX, and that opened up all activities at universities, not only athletics, but organizations, clubs, to women. And that was the first time we started seeing women's athletics come along. And that's been a tremendous, wonderful change. And I talked to Birch Bayh just a little before he died, about a year before he died, and he considered that one of the great things that he did, and he loved to sit in his house and watch women's basketball. Yeah,
and the women's program for years, of course, was tremendous. You know, they're sort of trying to get back up to the level they were at under Lynn Dunn and some of the other coaches that preceded or followed her. But again, great tradition for women's basketball, great tradition for volleyball with Dave Shondell.
Yep.
So, yeah, Purdue women's athletics has more than held its own and represented the university very well. Again, we want to thank John for coming by and visiting with us. Remember his book coming out, Ever True, 150 Years of Giant Leaps at Purdue University. There it is on the screen again for you. May 6th, right? Purdue
May
Founders
6th.
Day.
Forward by Mitch Daniels. And we
Forward by Mitch
sure
Daniels.
Appreciate that.
That's a great selling point right there. So you pick up the book starting then, and again, a lot of great tales. And John, we appreciate you stopping by today.
Thank you very much.
We'll be back for segment 3. We're going to talk to Alan Carpet, get a scoop on Purdue in the Sweet 16, and Kelly Kitchell's going to hop back in with me. Stay tuned.